What would you do if you rescued a helpless puppy, only to discover weeks later that it wasn't a dog at all? The storm had been relentless, all night sheets of rain hammering against the pavement, wind howling like a living thing. The highway stretched ahead, dark and slick, reflecting the glow of Jake Turner's truck headlights. Jake, a firefighter fresh off a brutal 24-hour shift, gripped the steering wheel, fighting the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. His eyes burned, and his muscles ached from hauling people out of burning buildings. His only goal? Get home, collapse onto his couch, and sleep for days. But then movement. A small, dark shape on the side of the road, barely visible through the downpour. Jake blinked hard, his tired brain struggling to process. Probably just storm debris. A blown tire, maybe a chunk of tree, nothing worth stopping for. But as he got closer, a strange instinct crawled up his spine. That wasn't trash. That was something alive. Cursing under his breath, he flipped on his hazard lights and pulled onto the shoulder. 5 more minutes and I would have been home, he muttered. He grabbed his flashlight from the glove box and stepped into the storm. The rain immediately soaked through his jacket, sending an icy chill through his body. He adjusted the beam, sweeping it over the shoulder of the road until... there, a tiny, shivering creature curled into a ball, barely more than a shadow against the wet asphalt. Jake's heart tightened. It was a puppy, or at least, it looked like one. Its fur was drenched and matted, clinging to its frail body. It was too small with delicate features and an oddly pointed snout. He crouched down, speaking softly. "Hey, little guy, you okay?" Slowly, and then it lifted its head and let out the faintest, softest chirp. Jake froze. Wait. Puppies don't chirp. Before we continue, tell us where in the world are you watching from? And if you love stories like this, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. Jake stood there, drenched, stunned. The creature looked up at him with wide, dark eyes. Tiny, helpless. Maybe he imagined it. He was exhausted. That had to be it. With a sigh, he shrugged off his jacket and wrapped the trembling animal inside. The poor thing didn't even struggle too weak to resist. "All right, buddy. Let's get you warm." Back in the truck, Jake turned up the heat and stole a quick glance at his unexpected passenger. Something felt off. The creature wasn't shaped quite right. Its snout was too sharp. Its ears were too large for its tiny face. And the way it curled up in his lap, it didn't feel like a puppy. It felt like something else. Then it chirped again. Jake's grip on the wheel tightened. His gut told him he had just brought something home that wasn't a dog. But what the hell was it? Jake pulled into his driveway, the storm still raging outside. His boots splashed through puddles as he hurried to the front door, clutching the tiny creature against his chest. It had stopped shivering as much, but its little body still felt too cold against his palm. "All right, buddy, let's get you inside," Jake murmured as he fumbled with the lock. The moment he stepped inside, warmth washed over him, a stark contrast to the freezing rain outside. He kicked the door shut behind him and flipped on the lights. The soft glow illuminated the creature in his arms now that it was drier. Something about it still seemed off. Shaking off the thought, Jake carried the little furball straight to his bathroom. He grabbed his softest towel, the one his sister had gifted him last Christmas, and began gently rubbing the tiny creature dry. Underneath all that wet fur was a thin, bony body, barely more than skin and bones. Jake felt a pang in his chest. "You've had it rough, huh?" he said softly. The little thing blinked up at him with dark, glassy eyes, then let out a sound. Chirp. Jake paused mid-motion. "Still making bird noises, huh?" Bobby the name suddenly popped into his head. "Yeah, you kinda look like a Bobby," Jake said, testing the name. The little creature sneezed. "I'll take that as approval." Jake finished drying him off and wrapped him snugly in the towel, placing him near the heater in his living room. The creature curled into a tight ball, still trembling slightly but looking much better than before. Now that he could finally get a good look at him, Bobby almost looked like a German Shepherd mix. Almost. His ears were a little too big, standing up at sharp angles. His snout was more pointed than a regular puppy's, and his furno dry had a strangely wild texture. Jake shook his head. Nah, he's just a weird-looking puppy. He got up and made his way to the kitchen, rummaging through the fridge. Let's see what I've got for you. The only thing remotely puppy-friendly was some turkey slices, so he grabbed a few, ripped them into small pieces, and placed them near Bobby's blanket. Bobby sniffed the food. And then, instead of eating it, he picked up a piece and hid it behind the couch. Jake blinked. What? Bobby took another piece, trotted over to Jake's work boots by the door, and stuffed the turkey inside one of them. Was he hallucinating? What are you doing? He asked, baffled. Bobby didn't respond obvious, but he grabbed another tiny piece of turkey and scurried toward the bookshelf, shoving it behind a stack of old fire department manuals. Jake just stared. Dude, you don't have to hoard food. No one's taking it from you. Bobby finally stopped, tilting his head, those two intelligent eyes locking onto Jake's face. Then, as if nothing had happened, he trotted back to his blanket and curled up into a tiny, fluffy ball. Jake shook his head in disbelief. You are one weird puppy. A few hours later, Jake was stretched out on the couch, half asleep, the exhaustion from his 24-hour shift catching up to him. Just as he was about to drift off, he heard a strange noise. A tiny chirping sound. His eyes snapped open. The soft scratching of claws against hardwood followed, then the rustling of movement near the heater. Jake turned his head slowly, expecting to see Bobby shifting in his sleep. But no. Bobby was wide awake, creeping through the living room like a tiny silent hunter. His movements weren't like a normal puppy's clumsy floppy steps. Instead, he moved smoothly, like a little predator stalking prey. Jake sat up, his firefighter instincts kicking in. Something wasn't right. Hey, he whispered, not wanting to startle him. Bobby froze mid-step, his large ears twitching. Then, he chirped again. Jake exhaled sharply. Man, you are really committed to that bird impression. Bobby tilted his head, then, without warning, pounced. Jake barely had time to react before Bobby dove onto something near the bookshelf, letting out a high-pitched squeak. Jake jumped to his feet, heart pounding. What the? Then he saw it. A tiny bug, barely the size of a dime, was trapped beneath Bobby's little paws. Jake let out a breath of laughter, running a hand through his damp hair. You were hunting a bug? Bobby sat back, looking oddly proud of himself. Jake shook his head. You're definitely not normal, buddy. Still amused, he scooped Bobby up and carried him back to his makeshift bed. All right, tiny Terminator, let's get some sleep. Bobby didn't resist. He curled up into a tight ball again, letting out a final soft chirp before dozing off. Jake lay back down, staring at the ceiling. Something about Bobby was off. But for now, it didn't matter. He was safe. He was warm. And for some reason, Jake already knew this little guy belonged with him. Tomorrow, he'd check if anyone had reported a missing puppy. And he had a weird feeling. No one was looking for Bobby. A week had passed since Jake rescued Bobby, and every day things just got weirder. For starters, Bobby never barked. Not once. No whining, no growling, no excited yips, just chirps. Then there was the food hoarding. Every morning, Jake would find scraps of turkey, kibble, or even pieces of his sandwich hidden in the strangest places inside his boots, behind couch cushions, and once, tucked inside the pocket of his fire station jacket. And Bobby's movements. Normal puppies were playful and clumsy. They tumbled around, wagged their tails, chewed on everything. But Bobby? He stalked. He'd slink into tight spaces like a tiny ninja, creeping along the edges of the room. Instead of chasing a ball, he'd lunge at it with alarming precision. shaking it violently as if trying to break its neck. Jake tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that Bobby was just a weird puppy. But something in his gut told him otherwise. Finally, he decided to take Bobby to Dr. Green, the local veterinarian who had treated plenty of strays in her career. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and wet dog, but Bobby didn't seem fazed. In fact, he sat inside his carrier way too calmly, his dark eyes scanning the room like he was observing a crime scene. When Dr. Green stepped into the exam room, she smiled. "So, what do we have here?" Jake chuckled nervously. "A weird puppy. Or maybe an alien. I haven't decided yet." Dr. Green lifted Bobby onto the metal exam table, running her hands along his small frame. Then her brows furrowed. She inspected his legs, gently pried open his mouth to check his teeth, and carefully examined his oversized ears. A moment later, she straightened up, crossing her arms. "Jake, what exactly did you say this was?" Jake's stomach tightened. "A dog?" Dr. Green sighed, rubbing her temples. "Yeah, no, this is not a dog." Silence. Jake blinked at her. Bobby blinked at Jake. "Come again?" Dr. Green exhaled, then motioned for Jake to look closer. "Check out his teeth." Jake leaned in. Bobby's teeth were sharper than a normal puppy-stinny razor-like fangs. Dr. Green continued. "See his snout? A little longer than usual. And his legs? Notice how his limbs are more delicate, built for agility rather than strength." Jake's mouth went dry. "Jake, you've been raising a fox." Jake stared. Then he laughed because obviously this was a joke. "You're messing with me," he said, shaking his head. "He's just weird looking." Dr. Green gave him a flat look. "I'm serious." She grabbed her phone, pulled up a photo of a red fox kit, and turned the screen toward Jake. Jake's heart dropped. The fox in the picture looked exactly like Bobby. "Oh, hell." Dr. Green nodded. "Yep." Jake ran a hand down his face. "So, you're telling me I've been feeding, bathing, and dear God cuddling a wild animal?" "Pretty much." Bobby, completely unaware of the existential crisis happening over his head, licked his paw and let out another chirp. Jake groaned. "I should have known. The food hoarding, the sneaky movements, the fact that he literally chirps." Dr. Green smirked. "Yeah, those were definitely clues." Jake dragged a hand through his hair, trying to process. "Okay, so what do I do now? Just let him go?" Dr. Green's expression turned serious. "It's not that simple. He's imprinted on you." Jake frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," she explained, "Bobby was too young when you found him. He sees you as his family now. If you release him into the wild, he won't survive." Jake looked down at the tiny fox, his heart twisting. This little guy had trusted him, depended on him. And now, he wasn't even supposed to be here. Dr. Green hesitated, then sighed. "Jake, there's something else you need to know." Jake's stomach dropped. "What?" She shifted uncomfortably. "In this state, keeping a fox as a pet is illegal." Jake's pulse spiked. "Wait, what?" Dr. Green nodded grimly. "Wildlife authorities don't allow foxes to be domesticated. If someone finds out you have him..." Jake already knew where this was going. "They'll take him away," he finished, his jaw clenching. Dr. Green nodded. "And they don't always relocate them to sanctuaries. Some are considered too domesticated to survive in the wild, but not tame enough to be pets." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Jake swallowed hard. "So what do I do?" Dr. Green gave him a long look. "You have two options. You can try to get a special permit to keep him as a non-releasable rescue, or you'll have to find a sanctuary that will take him." Jake looked at Bobby. Bobby looked back at him. Jake let out a slow breath. Number he wasn't giving up on him. Not now. Not ever. Jake gripped the steering wheel tighter as he drove home from the vet's office, his mind racing. Bobby wasn't a dog. He was a fox. And worse, it was illegal to keep him. Jake stole a glance at the tiny creature curled up in the passenger seat, completely oblivious to the chaos unraveling in Jake's head. Bobby stretched, let out a soft chirp, then curled back into a tight little ball. Jake exhaled. "You really don't make this easy, do you?" He had 2 weeks. That's how long the wildlife officer had given him to either secure a permit or surrender Bobby to the authorities. If he failed, they'd take Bobby away. And that wasn't an option. The moment Jake got home, he sat at his kitchen table, flipping open his laptop. He wasn't a lawyer, but he sure as hell was about to become an expert in exotic animal laws. He typed furiously, "Can you keep a fox as a pet in his state?" No, foxes are classified as wildlife and cannot be privately owned. Jake scowled. Not helpful. How to get a permit for a rescued fox? Some states allow permits for non-releasable wildlife, but approval is rare and must be filed through wildlife agencies. Jake's pulse quickened. That was something. He needed proof that Bobby couldn't survive in the wild. Jake grabbed his phone and started recording. "This is Bobby," he said, turning the camera toward the tiny fox who was busy stuffing a piece of chicken inside Jake's boot. Jake sighed. As you can see, he has quirks. Bobby, completely unfazed, tried to bury the chicken under the couch. Jake followed him around for the next hour, documenting everything. Instead of barking, his food-hoarding obsession, his complete disinterest in other dogs. "Called Dr. Green. I need a formal statement from you," he said. Dr. Green sighed on the other end. "Jake, permits like this are nearly impossible to get." "I have to try," Jake insisted. "He's already domesticated. He wouldn't last a day in the wild." There was a pause. "All right, I'll put together an evaluation." Bring everything he could. Vet records proving Bobby had been raised in captivity. A letter from Dr. Green confirming that Bobby was non-releasable. Testimonies from his fellow firefighters about how Bobby acted more like a house pet than a wild animal. He even called wildlife sanctuaries, hoping one might take Bobby in case the permit failed. "Sorry," one woman told him. "We're full, and foxes that are too tame don't do well in our enclosures." Jake gritted his teeth. That wasn't an option either. 3 days before the deadline, a knock at the door sent Jake's stomach plummeting. Through the peephole, he saw a wildlife officer. Jake took a deep breath and opened the door. "Officer." "Mr. Turner," the man said, flipping through his clipboard. "Just following up on the exotic pet report." Jake forced a calm nod. "I'm working on securing a permit." The officer raised a brow. "That's highly unusual." Jake stood firm. "But not impossible." The officer glanced around. "Can I see the animal?" Jake hesitated but nodded. He led him inside, where Bobby sat on the couch, staring at the officer like he was some kind of criminal. The officer took one look at him and frowned. "That is definitely a fox." Bobby let out a smug chirp. Jake had never wanted to throttle an animal more in his life. The officer sighed. "Look, I'll be back in 3 days. If you don't have an approved permit by then, we have to confiscate him." Jake clenched his jaw. "I'll have it," he promised. Jake barely slept. With only 2 days left, he sent his full application to the state wildlife department. He wrote a passionate plea about how Bobby was part of his family, how he wouldn't survive if relocated. Then he waited and waited. Each hour that passed felt heavier. The stress was crushing. By the morning of the deadline, there was still no response. Jake stared at his phone, heart pounding. If they said no, he was out of options. Then his email dinged. Shook as he opened it. "Mr. Turner, after reviewing your case, we have approved a temporary wildlife care permit under specific conditions." Jake nearly dropped his phone. Bobby was safe. For now. When the officer came back that afternoon, Jake handed him the official permit. The man scanned it, sighed and nodded. "Well, I'll be damned. You actually pulled it off. Jake exhaled deeply. Yeah, looks like Bobby's staying. Bobby, sensing the tension break, hopped onto Jake's lap and chirped. The officer shook his head, muttering, "Weirdest case I've had all year." Jake just grinned. "You have no idea." 3 weeks had passed since Jake had secured Bobby's permit, and life was finally settling into a routine. Bobby had his own designated outdoor enclosure, just like the wildlife authorities required, but in true Bobby fashion, he still preferred sleeping on Jake's couch or curling up on top of Jake's laundry pile. At the firehouse, Bobby had become a legend. The guys loved him, despite their endless teasing. Eddie, Jake's best friend and fellow firefighter, had even gotten Bobby a tiny custom fire station badge. "All right, tell me this isn't the cutest thing ever," Eddie smirked, holding up the badge. Jake rolled his eyes. "He's not a fire dog, Eddie." Yeah, Eddie waved him off. "But he's the fire fox." Chirped approvingly. Jake shook his head. Yep, this was his life now. But then, everything changed. 2:14 a.m. Jake was in a deep sleep when the firehouse alarm blared through the dorms. His eyes flew open. Warehouse fire, Henderson Industrial Park. Multiple structures involved. Possible victims trapped. Jake was out of bed in seconds, shoving on his boots and grabbing his gear. Within minutes, the team was suited up and racing through the city, sirens wailing. As they approached the site, Jake's stomach tightened. The entire sky glowed orange. This wasn't just a fire. It was an inferno. "All right, listen up," Captain Martinez barked as they pulled up. "We've got reports of 2 workers unaccounted for last seen in the north section of the warehouse." Jake's heart pounded. The north section was already collapsing. "We need 2 inside Turner, Eddie. You're up." Jake gave a firm nod, adrenaline spiking through his veins. The heat slammed into him the moment they stepped inside. Flames roared around them, licking the metal beams, twisting and curling like hungry monsters. Smoke filled the air, thick and suffocating, making visibility near zero. Jake's heartbeat thundered in his ears as they moved forward, searching for any sign of life. They had just reached the main corridor when a deafening crack split the air. Jake barely had time to react before the ceiling gave way. A massive steel beam crashed down, cutting off their exit. Flames surged, sealing them inside. Cut through the chaos, Jake coughed hard, choking on smoke. His radio crackled with static. "We're trapped," Jake shouted into the comms. "Hold tight, we're working on a way in," came the captain's reply. But Jake knew the truth. They didn't have time. Back at home, Bobby woke with a start. His ears flicked forward. Something wasn't right. He trotted to the front door, sniffing the air. His instincts were screaming at him danger. Something was wrong with Jake. Without hesitation, Bobby leaped onto the windowsill. The window was cracked open just enough. He squeezed through and vanished into the night. Jake and Eddie were running out of options. The flames were closing in fast, and their only possible exit was blocked by debris. Jake's lungs burned. His mask was running low on oxygen. "This is bad." Thina sound. A chirp. Jake's eyes snapped open. No way. Through the thick smoke, a small, darting figure appeared near the collapsed beams. Tiny paws skittered across debris, dodging embers. Bobby. Jake's brain short-circuited. "What the?" Eddie coughed. "Dude, tell me I'm hallucinating, because I think I just saw a fox." Jake didn't have time to explain. Bobby let out another chirp and darted toward an opening in the debris. He wriggled through a gap Jake hadn't noticed before. A way out. "Oh, you little genius," Jake breathed. Summoning every ounce of strength, Jake grabbed Eddie's arm. "Come on, we're following the fox." Jake and Eddie crawled after Bobby, squeezing through the narrow opening. The smoke was unbearable. The heat seared their gear, but Bobby led them through, his tiny form barely visible through the haze. And then fresh air? Jake stumbled out of the wreckage just as the rest of the team rushed forward. "We got him!" someone shouted. The paramedics swarmed in, checking their vitals. Jake ripped off his mask, gasping. Then his eyes darted around. "Where's Bobby?" A few feet away, Bobby sat on the pavement, his fur singed at the tips, but otherwise unharmed. The tiny fox let out an exhausted chirp before collapsing dramatically onto his side. A breathless laugh. "Yeah, same, buddy, same." The next morning, Jake's phone exploded with messages. Apparently, someone had filmed Bobby running into the fire. The firehouse had posted it online, and within hours, the internet went wild. Comments flooded in. "That's a hero. Give that fox a medal. Bro, he risked his tail to save you." Even the local news stations picked up the story. Phone in his face. "Dude, you and Bobby are viral." Jake rolled his eyes. "Great." Eddie smirked. "They're calling him the Fire Fox." Jake glanced at Bobby, who was currently attempting to steal his sock. Jake sighed. Yeah, this fox was definitely a hero, and his life would never be the same again. Jake sat at his kitchen table, staring at the plain white envelope in front of him. His coffee sat untouched, steam curling in the air, forgotten. The official seal of the Wildlife Department was stamped across the front. This was it. This letter held Bobby's future. Jake inhaled deeply and tore it open. His eyes scanned the first few lines, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then he saw it. Approved. Jake blinked. Then he read it again just to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. Approved. His request to keep Bobby had been granted. Bobby wasn't going anywhere. The little fox, oblivious to the life-changing news, was currently rolling around on the floor, battling one of Jake's socks like it was his mortal enemy. Jake let out a breathless laugh. "Guess what, buddy? You're staying." Bobby, as if sensing the shift in mood, chirped and immediately stole Jake's other sock. Jake sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Yeah, I should have seen that coming." Later that afternoon, Jake called Dr. Green to tell her the news. She actually gasped on the other end of the phone. "They approved it?" she asked, stunned. "Yep," Jake said, grinning. "Bobby's officially a non-releasable rescue fox under my care." Dr. Green laughed. "Jake, I have to admit I didn't think you had a shot. Those permits are almost impossible to get." "Tell me about it," Jake muttered, thinking about the ridiculous amount of paperwork, videos, testimonies, and sleepless nights that had gone into making this happen. "Well, congratulations," Dr. Green said warmly. "Bobby's lucky to have you." Jake glanced at Bobby, who was currently stuffing a stolen granola bar under the couch. "Yeah," Jake said softly. "I think I'm the lucky one." With legal approval came responsibilities. The Wildlife Department required that Jake build Bobby a proper outdoor enclosure safe, spacious, and equipped to meet wildlife regulations. So, for the next few weeks, Jake and his firefighter buddies went to work. They constructed a massive, fenced-in habitat in Jake's backyard complete with dig-proof barriers, because, despite his size, Bobby could be a little escape artist. Climbing structures and platforms to simulate the trees foxes love to explore. Natural fox burrow. The finished enclosure was a work of art, the perfect blend of safety and freedom. Bobby even use it? The first time Jake let him inside, Bobby sniffed around cautiously. Then, instead of exploring his new home, he promptly trotted back inside the house, hopped onto the couch, and curled up on Jake's pillow. Jake sighed. "You know you have a whole custom-built fox kingdom out there, right?" Bobby chirped sleepily. Jake shook his head. Yeah, I get it. You're an indoor fox." With Bobby's place in Jake's home secured, the firehouse naturally claimed him as their own. Eddie was the biggest instigator. "We have a station dog," he argued one day, holding up a tiny firefighter vest with Bobby stitched on the back. So why not a station fox? Jake groaned. He's not a fire dog, Eddie. Eddie smirked. Yeah, but he's the fire fox. Jake rolled his eyes. But Bobby? Bobby wore the vest like a champ. He quickly became the station's unofficial mascot, trotting around like he owned the place. He stole sandwiches from unsuspecting firefighters. The hell out of people. He figured out how to turn on the coffee maker, which nearly caused a station-wide caffeine overdose. Captain Martinez shook his head one day, watching Bobby stalk a mop like it was prey. This fox is going to be the death of me, he muttered. But he was smiling. One evening, about a year after the fire, Jake was sitting on his porch, sipping a beer, watching Bobby perch on the fence. Beyond the backyard, in the tree line, 2 wild foxes stood watching. Bobby froze. Jake's heart clenched. This was it. The moment he'd always known might come. The call of the wild. For the first time, Bobby looked conflicted. Jake inhaled. If you want to go, buddy, I won't stop you. Bobby's ears twitched. His nose twitched toward the air. Then, slowly, he turned back to Jake. He hopped off the fence, trotted over, and pressed his face against Jake's arm. Jake let out a slow breath, smiling. Yeah, I thought so. The wild might have called, but Bobby had already chosen his home. As the sun set, Bobby curled up beside Jake, watching the stars. Jake reached down, scratching behind his ears. You saved my life, you know that? Bobby tilted his head, then let out a soft, affectionate chirp. I love you too, buddy. Some people adopted dogs. Some people got cats. Jake? He got a fox. And somehow, it was the best thing that had ever happened to him. A year had passed since that stormy night when Jake Turner pulled over to rescue what he thought was a helpless puppy. Since then, life had never been the same. This letter held Bobby's future. Jake inhaled deeply and tore it open. His eyes scanned the first few lines, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then he saw it. Approved. Jake blinked. Then he read it again just to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. Approved. His request to keep Bobby had been granted. Bobby wasn't going anywhere. The little fox, oblivious to the life-changing news, was currently rolling around on the floor, battling one of Jake's socks like it was his mortal enemy. Jake let out a breathless laugh. Guess what, buddy? You're staying. Bobby, as if sensing the shift in mood, chirped and immediately stole Jake's other sock. Jake sighed, rubbing his forehead. Yeah, I should have seen that coming. Later that afternoon, Jake called Dr. Green to tell her the news. She actually gasped on the other end of the phone. They approved it? She asked, stunned. Yep, Jake said, grinning. Bobby's officially a non-releasable rescue fox under my care. Dr. Green laughed. Jake, I have to admit, I didn't think you had a shot. Those permits are almost impossible to get. Tell me about it, Jake muttered, thinking about the ridiculous amount of paperwork, videos, testimonies, and sleepless nights that had gone into making this happen. Well, congratulations, Dr. Green said warmly. Bobby's lucky to have you. Jake glanced at Bobby, who was currently stuffing a stolen granola bar under the couch. Yeah, Jake said softly. I think I'm the lucky one. With legal approval came responsibilities. The wildlife department required that Jake build Bobby a proper outdoor enclosure safe, spacious, and equipped to meet wildlife regulations. So, for the next few weeks, Jake and his firefighter buddies went to work. They constructed a massive fenced-in habitat in Jake's backyard complete with dig-proof barriers because, despite his size, Bobby could be a little escape artist. Climbing structures and platforms to simulate the trees foxes love to explore. Natural fox burrow. The finished enclosure was a work of art, the perfect blend of safety and freedom. Bobby even use it? The first time Jake let him inside, Bobby sniffed around cautiously. Then, instead of exploring his new home, he promptly trotted back inside the house, hopped onto the couch and curled up on Jake's pillow. Jake sighed. You know you have a whole custom-built fox kingdom out there, right? Bobby chirped sleepily. Jake shook his head. Yeah, I get it. You're an indoor fox. With Bobby's place in Jake's home secured, the firehouse naturally claimed him as their own. Eddie was the biggest instigator. We have a station dog, he argued one day, holding up a tiny firefighter vest with Bobby stitched on the back. So why not a station fox? Jake groaned. He's not a fire dog, Eddie. Eddie smirked. Yeah, but he's the fire fox. Jake rolled his eyes. But Bobby wore the vest like a champ. He quickly became the station's unofficial mascot, trotting around like he owned the place. He stole sandwiches from unsuspecting firefighters. The hell out of people. He figured out how to turn on the coffee maker, which nearly caused a station-wide caffeine overdose. Captain Martinez shook his head one day, watching Bobby stalk a mop like it was prey. This fox is going to be the death of me, he muttered. But he was smiling. One evening, about a year after the fire, Jake was sitting on his porch, sipping a beer, watching Bobby perch on the fence. Beyond the backyard, in the tree line, 2 wild foxes stood watching. Bobby froze. Jake's heart clenched. This was it. The moment he'd always known might come. The call of the wild. For the first time, Bobby looked conflicted. Jake inhaled. If you want to go, buddy, I won't stop you. Bobby's ears twitched. His nose twitched toward the air. Then, slowly, he turned back to Jake. He hopped off the fence, trotted over, and pressed his face against Jake's arm. Jake let out a slow breath, smiling. Yeah, I thought so. The wild might have called, but Bobby had already chosen his home. As the sun set, Bobby curled up beside Jake, watching the stars. Jake reached down, scratching behind his ears. You saved my life, you know that? Bobby tilted his head, then let out a soft, affectionate chirp. I love you too, buddy. Some people adopted dogs. Some people got cats. Jake? He got a fox. And somehow, it was the best thing that had ever happened to him. A year had passed since that stormy night when Jake Turner pulled over to rescue what he thought was a helpless puppy. Since then, life had never been the same.